All right, let's get cooking. Welcome to the latest edition of Chin Check Sports Radio. I'm your host, JD. I want to thank you all for taking the time out to join us. And as always, we welcome any suggestions, feedback, comments, and criticisms, which improves the quality of our program, which ultimately improves your listening experience. Before we get started, we want to send all of you our thank yous for your support. People are slowly but surely finding out about who we are and what we do. They respect and enjoy the passion with which we speak. And we do this because we love this, and we continue to share our passions with you all as we build our listening army to take over the world. On this particular episode, it's something that we have been sitting on, and we wanted to take our time and put this together because we wanted to really think deep and go deep with the topic that you see on your screen right now, or the topic that you see on the link that I sent some of my close friends. There's a quote by John Boyd Orr that reads, "Empires won by conquest have always fallen either by revolt within or by defeat by a rival." Let me say this again. A quote that is attributed to John Boyd Orr states, "Empires won by conquest have always fallen either by revolt within or by defeat by a rival." Now, when you think of empires, you think of vast land, you think of real estate, you think of war, you think of combat, you think of death, you think of famous empires, the British Empire, that the United States became an independent nation fighting out of that. The Ottoman Empire before World War I. You think of the Roman Empire. You think of the Hun Empire, the Mongol Empire, the Russian Empire. So you think of great empires as vast land, kings, wars, etc., etc. But I think this quote is very apropos when it comes to professional boxing. Why is that? As a top fighter, when you reach the apex, when you reach the pinnacle, when you are seen as top of the food chain, you are seen as an empire unto yourself, even though boxing is an individual sport, but you are seen as an empire unto yourself. Think of some of the great names, at least in my lifetime. The Mike Tysons, the Floyd Mayweathers, obviously before my lifetime, Muhammad Ali, Oscar De La Hoya, Roy Jones Jr. So when you think of fighters who are seen as empires unto themselves, because we still talk about fighters who've been dead for 40, 50 years and still give them shots and reasonable chances in rematches today. So this goes to show you, when you're top of the food chain, when you're a top level professional fighter, you are seen as an empire unto yourself. Now, how do you become the empire? By simply winning fights, by winning, quote, conquest inside the squared circle, where you are dominating your division, you're dominating other champions, you're dominating your era. So you become an empire unto yourself when you establish yourself oftentimes as the best or one of the best fighters of your division and of your era, and obviously your weight class or weight classes. So where does you fall come from? Well, oftentimes in boxing is from defeat by a rival. Okay, so you lose to another great fighter, you have a couple of bad losses, you're no longer the fighter that's on top. And as we know in boxing, very few fighters retire undefeated because it's such a hard sport. So put that into perspective. The Floyd Mayweathers, the Joe Calzaghes, the Ricardo Lopez's, Rocky Marciano, is very rare that fighters retire undefeated from the sport of boxing. It's just a very rare feat. So think of those fighters that I just named, plus think of all the other professional fighters that have come and gone. So when you're knocked off that perch, is why it's through another rival. But sometimes a fighter internally can be his own worst enemy, which brings us to Deontay Wilder. And this was an article that his trainer, Mark Breland, recently spoke out about his experiences with Deontay Wilder. Now, if you go back and listen to the broadcast that we did after the Tyson Fury 2 fight, explaining some of the reasons why Deontay wasn't getting any better. Well, after that Tyson Fury and Deontay Wilder rematch, Deontay Wilder fires Mark Breland. And we didn't agree with it. After that rematch, Deontay Wilder gave every excuse in the book. First it was, the costume. Then it was Mark Breland, and Mark Breland didn't let me go out on my shield, and he spiked my water, and very abnormal behavior from Deontay Wilder, even though from a psychoanalytic standpoint, I understood where he was coming from. Now, as the trainer, Mark Breland watched his fighter suffer 2 knockdowns, getting beaten from pillar to post, floundering around the ring. As the seconds went by, as the minutes went by, as the rounds went by, you saw Deontay's chances of winning that fight just less and less. There was no possible way that Deontay was going to win that fight, on top of the blood coming out of his ear, which again, something that in the hundreds of fights or thousands of fights that I've watched since I was a child, I've never seen a fighter bleeding out of his ear. So clearly Mark Breland, as a trainer, it was his job to look out for the best interest of his fighter. Yes, I know a fighter would say, let me go out on my shield, I'd rather die in the ring, and that stuff sounds good. It's a lot of rhetoric, but the reality of it is, as a boxing trainer, it is your job to look out for your fighter's best interest. And in that rematch, Deontay Wilder clearly was not defending himself. He was a beaten fighter, and Mark Breland did the job that he was supposed to do as a trainer. Now, what I find funny, for those of us who recently watched the rematch, and please check out our review, who watched the trilogy, and please check out our review of said trilogy, the 11th-round knockout makes you wonder, did the same fate await Deontay Wilder in the rematch had Mark Breland not thrown in the towel? Again, I supported Mark Breland. I still support Mark Breland for making the decision to protect Deontay Wilder. Now, in theshadowleague.com, written by Rhett Butler, titled, Deontay Wilder Untrainable, says Mark Breland. Deontay Wilder is a sore loser, but apparently he is also a horrible winner, according to his former trainer Mark Breland. Breland, an Olympic gold medalist, was fired from Wilder's team after multiple accusations from a former heavyweight champion. After the coach threw in a towel during Wilder vs. Fury 2 to save Wilder from the same KO he experienced in the trilogy, I just said that, he was accused of being disloyal. However, Breland has broken his silence. Now, I'm going to give Mark Breland credit. Mark Breland really has not said anything since being fired, has not said anything since the accusations and the allegations. He's been quiet. He's played his position, and I'm assuming now he feels a time that is necessary for him to speak up, and I have no problems with that. The facts are that my time in the coaching position with the Bronze Bomber changed drastically in the 12 years since I started with him, wrote Breland on his Instagram. When he turned pro, JD's called me and humbly stated that he needed a trainer for a great prospect that he had at his gym. Boxing goes like this. You walk into my gym, I train you. I found you, and sometimes I manage you too. So Jay was seen as the head trainer in the media, but I was the only one on the team with a boxing resume, and I was the only trainer. That was okay with me because of my humility. I didn't have to be the one in front of the camera. I've lived that life. After Deontay became a name in boxing, new members did join the team, and it got to the point where didn't/don't even have my fighter's phone number. I haven't spoken to Deontay alone in years. The things that I told Deontay had to be ran past Jay first. Breland believes Wilder became untrainable at some point. Deontay had become untrainable because he was at the point of he know more about boxing than all of us. So teaching a correct jab was not a priority to learn once he continued on his knockout streak. So a coach can only teach someone if they're willing to learn. Says a lot right there. And it's something we said on a previous broadcast. Why in the world was Deontay's skills, why were they regressing even though he was winning? Because anybody with an objective boxing mind and objective boxing eye can tell that Deontay's skills were regressing. He was becoming too knockout reliant. And I go back to even the second Luis Ortiz fight where he was pretty much being outboxed for that entire fight until he scored that sensational knockout. But of course, we don't believe in just overreacting to losses and glossing over wins. It's good to look at what you did wrong in wins because those things can come back and haunt you. And Deontay Wilder found out the hard way. Now, let's really get into the background of Mark Breland. Mark Breland was one of the most decorated, if not the most decorated amateur that America has ever had. And I don't mean this as hyperbole. I mean that as ever had. We're talking, this man won the New York Golden Gloves 5 times. Now really put that into perspective. Won the Golden Gloves and even won more Golden Gloves, especially the New York Golden Gloves, more than Sugar Ray Robinson, who is considered the greatest professional fighter of all time. That's number one. The man had a 110-1 record as one of the top amateurs in America. Put that in perspective. An impressive amateur record of 110-1 with 73 knockouts. Okay? Winning the gold medal in the 1984 Summer Olympics. Now you asking yourself, really? A gold medal, and by the way, was on the same team with Meldrick Taylor. Go watch the Meldrick Taylor versus Julio Cesar Chavez 1 fight to show you how good Meldrick Taylor was. Evander Holyfield, who won a controversial bronze medal after having an awful disqualification in his amateur fight, and the late Pernell Sweet Pea Whitaker and Virgil Hill, former light heavyweight champion, won a silver medal. So this is a guy who, again, is probably one of the most decorated amateurs, maybe besides Roy Jones Jr. Okay, so we're throwing to Roy Jones. But clearly one of the most decorated amateurs that America has ever had, gone on to win the WBA welterweight champion. So this guy clearly is a boxer and has all the credentials to be a successful trainer in the sport. And again, this man has the resume, credentials, and credibility that anyone should listen to. Let's contrast that with JD's, whose brother was a boxing writer. He was a promoter, went to college on a baseball scholarship, and this is a guy who just loved boxing and decided to be a boxing trainer, which is why he reached out to someone who has the accolades like a Mark Breland. So how in the world just JD's become the head trainer or become the mouthpiece and figurehead, but as Mark Breland stated, he preferred to stay in the background. But it was apparent as Deontay's career progressed, as became I would say a household name, his skills started to really regress, and now you're starting to see some of the reasons why. Let's continue. Quote from Mark Breland: "We would wait for the champ for hours before he arrived at the gym, and Jay would inform us of his mood. If he had a bad day, we had to be quiet to not be on the receiving end of his wrath," according to Jay, in an effort not to be fired. Wow. And yeah, hitting the bag, jumping rope, and running is not high on the list. So if he don't feel like it, and Jay didn't seem to understand the importance of those things, so he would make it clear not to ask Deontay twice. If I try to pull Deontay to the side to tell him what I see, Jay made it clear, don't say nothing, you don't want to make him mad. I've watched this man, parenthetically Deontay, speak to many people disrespectfully, and although I'm extremely humble and calm, I'm a man first. I stayed on the team because I've been there from the beginning, and I believe with his power and willingness to learn more, he could be a force in the sport. I never thought anything this insane would take place. Okay. That part of the quote that we read, that is the revolt from within. Because clearly, Deontay Wilder did not take his craft seriously. He didn't spend the hours in the gym like a Muhammad Ali did, a Roy Jones, I wouldn't even say Roy Jones, a Bernard Hopkins did, a Floyd Mayweather did, a Manny Pacquiao did. He didn't spend the time to refine, hone, and perfect his craft, and it reared his ugly head when he ran into another professional fighter who he could not knock out. And Deontay Wilder fell victim to premature success and falling in love with his knockout power, and never saw fit to refine his skills, and you're hearing it from the trainer himself. We're going to continue on here. At some point, Wilder accused Breland of being involved in a conspiracy to dethrone him. He even suggested that Breland spiked his water in a corner during the second Fury fight. Also, that he was faulty while watching the hand wrapping process for Fury during his second fight. I should not have addressed who had the water because the accusation is so asinine it doesn't deserve a reply. Anyone who knows a tiny bit about boxing knows we're tested before and after a fight, so that's the end of that ludicrous allegation. And then there's the gloves. To that I say that's the one time I'm glad Jay treated me like I didn't matter. So he does all of the head trainer aspects, the witness for the hand wrapping, the press interviews, everything where a camera is involved except hand wraps. I'm the one responsible for that. I'm not sure if JD's knows in all those years. I can't recall seeing him do that. Now this chapter of my life book has come to an end and I won't be talking about it anymore. To the ones who know me, I don't need to say anything. To the ones who don't, I'm not trying to defend such ridiculous, outlandish allegations. Throwing in the towel. Lastly, at that fight, just as many others, we had no cut men because Deontay won't need it. So I'm not a doctor, but I know blood coming out of your ears and Dave's eyes could be a brain issue, and power comes from your legs, and the legs were gone. So I made a decision to stop the fight, and I'll do it all again. I have a son Deontay's age, and I'm not looking to see him go out on the shield. I hope we all stay safe. There are so many bigger issues in the world. Ladies and gentlemen, just listening and not listening, but reading the article and probably even listening to Mark Breland speak those words, I believe every single thing that Mark Breland said. Let me say this again. I believe every single thing that Mark Breland said. I believe Deontay didn't want to train. I believe Deontay had a bad attitude. I believe JD's a prime example of someone from the out who thinks that boxing is easy. Now, when you see why I say why people treat boxing like it's a damn joke, and with the Paul brothers and all these sham charity and exhibition matches, because again, Deontay didn't seem the need to fire JD's. He wanted to fire Mark Breland, but JD's is not a trainer. Prime example of a functional equivalent. Take Leonard Ellerbe. Great promoter, great manager, not a boxing trainer. If you go back and look a lot of Floyd Mayweather's fights, you would always see Leonard Ellerbe trying to give boxing advice, and he will always be overruled by Roger Mayweather. Why? He wasn't a boxer. Yes, you and Floyd are best friends. You got tattoos with TMT tattoos, and you and Floyd, and you are Floyd's confidant and everything else with it. Not taking anything away from that. But he was not a boxer, and he was not a boxing trainer. So I used to like when Leonard Ellerbe would try to give Floyd technical advice. You could tell that Roger, the late Roger Mayweather, would overrule Leonard Ellerbe and would kind of shut Ellerbe up. Same thing here with JD's. I wish Mark Breland would have spoke more, but clearly Deontay, JD's had the ear of Deontay versus an established fighter, a more decorated fighter than JD's can even snip the man's jockstrap, boxing shoes, gloves, anything. So that goes to show you the mentality of one Deontay Wilder. And let me say this, black folks have a thing where if another black person tells them something, they don't want to listen, but when a white person tells them the same exact thing, all of a sudden it's the greatest thing in the world. Yes, I said it. So Deontay Wilder really has nobody to blame but himself for his fall, because his fall was from within. And the fall from within preceded, the revolt from within preceded the defeat by a rival. Because again, a culmination of those factors, not wanting to jump rope, not wanting to hit the bag, not wanting to put the necessary work and the manpower in, it cost him in the long run, and deservedly so. And at this stage of his career, as we say, I don't think Deontay can really reach that level, because at this point, the blueprint is out on Deontay. I don't think that he can really change his skill set at this stage at 34, 35, pretty much his mid-30s. Because again, once he gets hit, will he revert back to form, which you saw in the third Fury fight? When he's exhausted, he reverts back to form. He never polished up his technique. If anything, I would say, and I don't want to say he's this version of a Riddick Bowe, because Riddick Bowe was a better technical boxer, but he was like Bowe in the sense that Bowe never reached his fullest potential, because in the case of Riddick Bowe, his boxing skills was never the issue. His work ethic was the issue. Putting on weight in between fights, and as big of a mouth that he had, he only held the title for 1 year. One time he held the title. And you think about it, in 1992, He wins the title in a classic fight, loses the title the very next year in 1993, partly because he came in 11 pounds overweight than he was in the previous fight with the Bowl World Tour. And by 1996, he was getting beaten by Andrew Galata. So Bowles' really years in boxing was those 4 years from 92 to 96. And by 96, he pretty much was done as a top professional fighter. So same thing with Deontay. Now, Deontay's issue wasn't about being in shape and stuff like that, but the same thing about not putting in the work ethic. So whether it's cardiovascular fitness and working on your stamina and eating proper food, the same rules apply when you're trying to hone your craft and perfect your craft, like the Bernard Hopkins, like the Floyd Mayweathers. Now take a Roy Jones, for instance, and I believe Bernard Hopkins said it best, and we said it on the Roy Jones review. Roy Jones had probably some of the most athletic gifts ever in the history of boxing. I'm talking about from a pure athletic standpoint. The problem is when those gifts started to betray him as he got older, he never refined and honed his craft. And as Bernard Hopkins said, lesser fighters began knocking him out. That was a revolt, or that was from an internal revolt that was within that person. But let's keep it on Deontay. Deontay fell in love with his knockout power. As Mark Breland stated, other people started joining the team, which means a series of yes men, which means people who became part of the team, who wanted to stay on the team, who wanted to be around a champion, became yes men and flunkies and lackeys, and of course, they're not going to tell you no. They're not going to tell you, hey man, you might get trained and you might want to get better. No, they're just happy being around the champion, where you have a trainer in Mark Breland who had to run ideas by a guy who really didn't know too much about boxing, at least in terms of the level of a Mark Breland, having to run ideas to a second-rate trainer, and I would even say a third-rate trainer and manager. So the fall of Deontay Wilder, he needs to look in the mirror for that. So I'm sure when he has his moment of self-reflection, he needs to think to himself, and if any one of you are Deontay Wilder fans, and we love Deontay, but have Deontay listen to this broadcast, it's on you, Deontay. You have nobody to blame but yourself. Because again, I believe every word that Mark Breland said. I believe you didn't prepare yourself. I believe you didn't want to train. I believe you didn't want to spend the man hours. I believe that you became too knockout reliant. I believe that you thought that, what do I have to train for? I can knock everybody out. And again, you wanting to knock everybody out, and at the time when you were on your winning streak, it was simply hiding and masking your sins, but they were brought to the forefront when really, even in the first Tyson Fury fight, if it wasn't for those couple of knockdowns, you probably would have lost that fight. And this is against a guy who really was a couple years removed from a competitive fight, came back, fought 2-0 fights, and pretty much whipped it for the first fight. But again, that knockdown in the 12th round gave Deontay a false sense of security because, again, it bailed him out. Even though Fury got up and I thought to dominate those final few seconds, but in Deontay's mind, I almost had the knockout, and it revealed itself worse in the rematch and even in the trilogy. What really happened, the man was knocked and he was out. In that last knockout, the man was out before he even hit the canvas, if you look at the way he hit the canvas. So I agree with Mark Breland. We definitely were sitting on this article. We wanted to definitely give our 2 cents on this. We definitely wanted to opine on this. And that's something that was near and dear to us because we get tired of fighters who are given success. They have yes men around them and they no longer want to get better. They become complacent. They become self-satisfied, and you can only get by on it for so long. Take a look at Mike Tyson, and we did a review of the Buster Douglas and Tyson fight. After he fired Kevin Rooney, after he got rid of his entire team that got him to the heavyweight championship of the world, after getting rid of that team who was there to refine and hone his skills, started listening to a bunch of yes men, most notably Don King. Mike was just knocking guys out, wasn't training anymore. The signs were there in fights against Frank Bruno and other fights where Tyson was being rocked. And it all culminated with the knockout loss to Buster Douglas, where I was watching an interview when Kevin Rooney said, I can look at Mike and say he hadn't trained for that fight. Okay, because you know your fighter. You know his body type, you know his structure. And Kevin Rooney took a look at Mike and said he hadn't been training. And then he pretty much expected Mike to lose that fight. Those things happen. Again, for Mike Tyson, the battle and his downfall that preceded the defeat by a rival was the internal revolt of not wanting to train and becoming complacent and having yes men around him. So let this be a lesson to fighters. Continue to build your craft. Continue to get better and you will have longevity. See Bernard Hopkins, see Floyd Mayweather. So this has definitely been a fun broadcast that we did. Until the next time, it's Chin Check Radio signing out.